So common wisdom tells us that Taiwanese people are either unaware, oblivious, or even don't particularly care about the possibility of military threats coming from the PRC. And what our survey results tell us is that not only are Taiwanese people aware of the possibility of conflict, but that they can tell the increase in military threats that have ramped up from the PRC over the last year. Our survey results show that 80% of respondents can tell that there's been an increase in military threats from the PRC over the last 6 months from when we conducted the survey in May. And 57% say that they are worried about the possibility of a conflict with the PRC happening in the Taiwan Strait. And what this tells us is, again, that Taiwanese people are worried, they're aware, and that the possibility of conflict is on their mind. But what we also find is that they're not increasingly panicked relative to how frequent these threats were before this period. So even though they can tell that there's been an increase in military threats from the PRC, the relative level of how fearful they are has not drastically increased from that period. And what that means is that even though Taiwanese people are aware of these threats and they're worried about these threats, they're not in a panic.
The threat to Taiwan from China has been discussed a lot more extensively lately in both international media and by foreign politicians. And something we often hear is that there must be panic in the streets of Taipei. The assumption being, as you mentioned, that if there isn't, Taiwanese people must be sleepwalking into disaster or they just don't care. But how would you explain this apparent gap in perception between people in Taiwan and people abroad?
So there's always a bit of a disconnect between how people in the United States, for example, respond to threats from the PRC and how people in Taiwan respond to threats from the PRC. When we see the types of threats that the PRC conducts towards Taiwan, we often feel panic and might respond by saying, wow, I would feel really scared if I lived in Taiwan. But for Taiwanese people who are entirely used to it at this point, it doesn't bother them on a daily basis. So even though there's headlines of fighter jets or Xi Jinping saying unification is going to happen no matter what, Taiwanese people are so used to it at this point that it doesn't necessarily solicit a response. But Taiwanese people are aware of both the frequency of these threats and they're still worried about the likelihood of war. So even though they kind of live with this constant condition of having to deal with the potential for, invasion and war on a near daily basis, it doesn't necessarily bother them in the way we might expect.